Jerry Pinkney's illustrations inundate the reader. They spill over from the cover to each page, cross pages, overwhelming us with their art and their life and their vibrancy. The impact of these images is almost physical. But how does Pinkney create this impact? Our book gives us some language to start unpacking that. You're going to be doing that in your groups, but let's practice it here together first. So, look at this image. Try to get the biggest one I can, and still, it's not going to have the effect of seeing it on the physical page like you do with the text, which hopefully all of you have. Pinkney uses watercolor. It's a very distinctive medium that characterizes most, if not all, of his illustrations. And the choice of watercolor, which is something that is associated with museum art, often called high art, sets these illustrations apart as works of art in and of themselves. And that's part of their power. Watercolors also have a sort of surreal quality to them in that they wash the world that is being created, and that feel, even though the illustration is itself remarkably realistic, getting the detailed anatomy of a lion and a mouse correctly, by putting it in the medium of watercolor, it still has the quality of illustration, as opposed to something like a photograph, which would make it even more realistic for the child viewer. Now, within these watercolors, what kind of visual elements do we see? Well, color is the most obvious. So we're going to skip that one, and we're going to go to line. Because line is what struck me when I was first looking at the cover of this book. So, the line in the lion's mane, which we see here in this illustration, and then in this one particularly well, is a masterpiece of expressing emotion through line. And we could say line and color, but let's go with line. So look at how the lines of the hair move. They're going out in all directions, almost like rays shooting out of a sun, which is correct, right? For a lion, their hair shoots out, their manes shoot out in all these different directions. But in this lion, the mane seems to express or seems to resonate with the emotion that the lion is experiencing right here, the fear, the terror, the chaos of being trapped in the hunter's net. Notice how the hair is so dramatically moving in all these directions, because that's what line does, right? Line moves our eye along either an implied point, like the implied line of the lion's gaze when the lion is looking down into the corner. We follow that to try to see what is that lion looking at. That's implied line. But these are explicit lines, right? These are, you can see the line of the paintbrush. Sometimes there's been some outlining done, because Pinkney very deliberately wants to move our eyes all over the place to sort of get that scattered feeling of, what's happening, just through the lion's hair. That is the brilliance of Pinkney's illustrations, that hair is expressing, sort of a microcosm expressing what is going on in the life of this lion. It's just particularly important in a wordless children's book. So as you're thinking of this, you are practicing analysis. We've gone from what's going on, style, watercolor, visual element, line, to why it matters, how it impacts the viewer. That right there is the sort of analysis that you're going to be doing in your paper and in your responses this week. Now, let's compare this with something dramatically different, which is Theodore Seuss Geisel's illustrations, aka Dr. Seuss's illustrations in Horton Hears a Who. So here's one image captured from the book, and another from the 60th edition, which come from the Art of Dr. Seuss collection. Seuss's style, we're going to call him Seuss, because that is the name that he used when he was writing. Seuss's style is completely different from that of Pinckney, and yet they can both be as effective with the child viewer in different ways and for different reasons. And in Seuss, let's look at the visual element of shape. So among other things, Seuss uses shape in very unexpected ways. And it's that unexpected power that gives the child reader some sort of sense of excitement and engagement, trying to figure out what's going on. So in the illustrations we're looking at, like right here, where we see a town, notice how curving lines, almost spiraling, and these sort of bumping flows of this multi-level living structure, city, are replacing the sort of quadrilateral triangles of American architecture with curves and bumps and spheres. That shift in the expected shape of architecture to this different shape of architecture lets the viewer know, without even the words that are filling the page, because the words, the rhymes, are the other half of his art, but the picture already lets the viewer know that this world here, Whoville, is very different from our world now. And that difference is part of sort of the marvel of the story, right? That Horton has discovered a world that nobody knew existed. Imaginary beings also have this sort of different shape. Elongated necks, curves, bumps, exaggerated hairstyles, body shapes that are unique and not that would be found in our world, in our reality. These also characterize Seuss's illustrations and intrigue the child because they're so different from the reality we're living in, which is, in part, the effect, the purpose of fantasy. If fantasy is create an internal logic and then provide in a unique imaginative setting, how do these different books do it? Pinckney briefly does it. Internal logic is that all of the creatures are anthropomorphic, right? They all talk. There doesn't need to be an explanation. We just accept that in this world, animals talk. But Pinckney creates an imaginative setting, even though he is sort of anatomically correct in his drawings of lions and mice, because it's impressionistic, it's watercolor. It has a vibrancy and an artistic quality that we don't see in everyday life, particularly with the watercolor. Seuss does it with his shapes, with the body shapes, with the architecture shapes. He creates this imaginative world, and the internal consistency is also expressed visually there, right? Because we can visually see that this is distinct, it sort of justifies or explains the fact that this visually distinct world might also have some distinctive rules or different rules, i.e. it is resting, the tiny world is resting on the puff of a flower, right? But it makes sense because it's also a world that has rounded, bumpy, spherical buildings that twirl and twist and people who don't look like us. So that is how, why, ins and outs of fantasy and illustration working together to impact the child reader. Now it's your turn. Can't wait to see what you do.